What's up, everybody? This is Alex Christoforou from the Duran, and today I have with me two guests. I have Peter Lavelle, host of RT's CrossTalk, on the one screen, either here or there, and I have Alexander Mercouris, Editor-in-Chief of the Duran, on the other screen, either here or there. Guys, are you all with me?
Yep. Yes.
All right. Today we're going to be talking about the recent resignations from the May government. All right, so let's start with Alexander in the UK. Set up the scenario as to what's going on right now in the Tory government.
I think what we're seeing is the beginnings of a split and of the end of Theresa May's government. Briefly, a few days ago, Theresa May came up with this idea of trying to get all the top ministers of her government to sign up to a Brexit plan, which would effectively have left the EU in a kind of association arrangement, rather Britain in a kind of association arrangement with the EU, whereby it continued to accept EU law indefinitely administered by the European Court of Justice. Now, it was very typical of Theresa May. She brought everybody together in this meeting from her cabinet. She managed to get them to agree to this programme, which is, of course, one which many of them had previously rejected. They all left, consulted with their supporters, were then told by their supporters this is completely unacceptable. And now we've seen two of the top Brexit ministers, David Davis, who was supposed to be negotiating the terms of Brexit with the EU, and Boris Johnson, who led the campaign in the referendum for Britain to leave the EU. They both resigned. They've done so just before Theresa May was due to speak to her MPs. Apparently, she has been jeered during that meeting. And I think we are in now a very short distance of seeing a motion by various Conservative MPs for Theresa May to go, or at least to stand for re-election as Tory leader. Her position as Prime Minister of Britain is hanging on a thread. And personally, I'm not sure that she's going to see the week out.
So, Peter, we have now, the UK has a bunch of the domestic policies and domestic issues that some government has to handle. But we also have a NATO meeting coming up. and we have Trump going to meet with Putin on the 16th. Right. And we have now this Brexit negotiation, which is never ending. What happens now going forward with all these issues?
First of all, I kind of maybe put a little dressing on what Alexander Mercouris had to say. Since when are you a little bit dead? Since when are you a little bit pregnant? I mean, it's Brexit or not, okay? And people voted for Brexit. They didn't vote for an association agreement. And we've seen this from Cameron all the way to the present, okay? Theresa May is working in a fundamentally undemocratic fashion. If she doesn't want to do it, she should step aside. And what she's done in the process is destroy the Tory leadership within, okay? And the issue of Brexit has not been resolved. And it was supposed to be given, the government was supposed to be presented to the government this week. They don't have the guy in place to do it. They don't have a foreign minister to speak for the country dealing with Europe. I mean, and now NATO allies with Donald Trump looming in the background. I mean, no leadership in the UK. I mean, and Theresa May has herself to blame for all of it. If she wasn't going to do Brexit, why did she take the job? That's how she got the job in the first place. Okay? I mean, I have asked rhetorically and very snarkily on my program, so when is Brexit going to happen? All right? I still don't know the answer to that question. Alexander, where do we stand on Brexit? Because this one issue, it connects all the other dots, okay? Because the whole world wants to know, what are we going to do with the UK? Are you in or are you out? Who's going to run the country? Is the Tory government going to stay in power? Is Jeremy Corbyn on the wings, and will the deep state let him rule? I mean, we could go on for hours, gents. Go ahead, Alexander.
Before Alexander, the question that that I would like to present is if Alexander can fill in some blanks. What happens if May falls, if she resigns? Process legally, according to the UK Constitution, what happens then? Does it go for a vote? For our viewers to understand, what's the process? Does it go for a vote? Does Corbyn take over? And then, like Peter said, what happens with Brexit? What are the next steps after that?
Well, actually, I'm going to say straight away, it's even worse than Peter says, because there's all sorts of other issues that we're going to talk about. But talking about this immediate problem, if Theresa May resigns this week as Prime Minister, the Constitution of Britain, the concept is that the Queen's government must be carried on. So we would have somebody, and it's not at all clear who, taking over as interim Prime Minister. The Conservatives, with their alliance party, the Democratic Unionists, just about have a majority in the House of Commons. So they would then presumably have a inner-party election to choose a new Tory leader. That person, whoever it is, would then become Prime Minister. There is an almost universal consensus that there would then have to be a general election, at which point the probabilities are, a latest opinion shows that Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party, which, to be clear, is a split on this issue, as the Conservative Party is, they would then form the government, and we would see the chaos that we see at the moment carry on and probably get worse. And that's the point I really want to make, because, of course, Peter is absolutely right that Theresa May has made a complete and utter mess of this ever since she became Prime Minister. But it's not clear that anyone else in Britain is in any better position to do it better, because this is a crisis, not just of Theresa May, but of the entire British political class. Boris Johnson, who led the Leave campaign, completely botched his leadership bid in 2016, which is why Theresa May became leader. It's quite clear that he never really intended to lead Britain out of the EU, but he ran that campaign simply to position himself as a future Prime Minister of a Conservative government. So he doesn't really have any idea what to do. Jeremy Corbyn, who I suspect probably does want to take Britain out of the EU, leads a party which is overwhelmingly committed to keeping Britain in the EU. And Peter is absolutely right. A majority of the people of Britain voted to leave. An overwhelming majority of the people of England voted to leave. And there is nobody at the moment leading them or articulating what they want, or giving any kind of program for what they voted for. So you have this utterly chaotic crisis situation, a massive political vacuum at the heart of Britain, and it's not easy at all at the moment to see how it's going to be resolved, whatever the outcome of the manoeuvres of this week.
What I think is really interesting, if I could just jump in here, is that I agree completely with Alexander Mercouris, and I'm sorry that I understated the crisis. Okay? Wow, that's very odd. It's very odd for me to do that. Yeah. But I think the interesting observation here, and I think we need to amplify it a little bit, is that Theresa May and Theresa May as a Tory and many in the Labour Party. There was never a consensus that, okay, the vote has happened and now we have to move forward. There's been such inertia because of this deep state and the establishment never to make this happen. So, I mean, actually their wishes come true, but what they've done is create an amazing political vacuum. There's a vacuum, there's a lack of confidence, a lack of the legality of what's going on right now, what kind of legitimacy any kind of new leader will have, and what will he or she do if it's the Tories, what will the electorate do, and we have Brexit hanging over, as Alexander rightfully points out, the Labour Party, considerable numbers of members still don't have their heart in any kind of Brexit at all. So it's turning into a very serious crisis, because almost wherever they go, because Theresa May never put her heart into she never put her political future on the line. She was always thinking about herself. the more she thought about herself, the more she screwed up the process. And now it's a huge minefield. And if you look from the outside, I mean, no wonder Trump he didn't want to show up. I mean, Theresa May isn't a person of gravitas to speak with, okay? And no wonder he wants to talk to Trump, because everybody at the NATO meeting, well, none of them have any gravitas. I mean, Alex and I have already written Merkel's eulogy, okay? It's already done, okay? Now Theresa May is toast, okay? No wonder Trump doesn't really care to talk to anybody in Europe.
So Peter, going off on that, what do you think is going through the minds of EU leaders and NATO leaders as they're seeing this from afar? I mean, they're seeing all this turmoil, they're seeing all this, and they've got all these important meetings coming up. What do you think is going through their minds, all these guys?
I think fundamentally they're saying, this is all a bad dream, right? This isn't really happening, is it? Okay, when are we going to wake up? Okay, I think that, we've seen. I mean, that the liberal media on the continent, in the UK and in the United States, is always putting a positive spin, a gloss over the vitality and the strength and the mission of NATO and the European Union. Well, it's none of the above, okay, at all. There's a crisis of confidence on the continent. We can go through all the elections recently if you want, and we've already done that in these podcasts, okay? But and with NATO, I mean, of course, with Theresa May, I don't even know if she's going to show up. I mean, who's going to want to talk to her? I mean, they're going to say, are you going to be joining the Screpples, Theresa? Okay, soon? Okay, meaning you're going to disappear? Okay, and Britain is the staunchest anti-Russian element within the alliance, okay, and now they're ticked off. Their voice isn't going to count because they don't have a leader that has any kind of legitimate power in the eyes of the outside world right now. And how do they move forward? I mean, Theresa May, the Brits were always the trump card because they're the most Russophobic against Russia and Putin. Now that's a card that's been taken off the table. What does it do? Where do they go from here? I don't know. I mean, who does? This is a crisis of confidence in these institutions, and the lack of political acumen on the part of the British ruling class. Okay, they got what they deserved. Okay, in so many words.
Alexander, can you elaborate for us how some of the other parties, specifically people like UKIP, are viewing this, and specifically maybe characters like Nigel Farage, who was the Brexit poster person for all of this. I mean, he's the guy that drove Brexit. So how do you think UKIP, Nigel Farage, and a lot of the people in the UK, especially people outside of London, who I think were the major voting bloc for Brexit, how are they viewing this crisis?
Well, the problem with UKIP is, of course, that Nigel Farage, I think, took a decision which I am sure he now regrets, which is that after the referendum, he resigned from the leadership of UKIP. And he is the towering figure within UKIP. Nobody who has replaced him has come close to matching him in his charisma and personality and his sheer political effectiveness. So the result is that UKIP, which does in a way represent, or did represent, a lot of the views of those people outside London who voted for Brexit, UKIP has all but disintegrated. Now, if you actually look at the other parties, the two big parties, the Conservative Party, you have in the Conservative Party a party which is overwhelmingly, in its membership and in its vote, pro-Brexit. And it is based in England, which is overwhelmingly pro-Brexit. You have a Prime Minister and a political elite who are either anti-Brexit or who want to water Brexit down as far as they possibly can. If you look at the Labour Party, you have a leadership there which is clearly anti-Brexit, apart possibly from Jeremy Corbyn. But 2/3 of Labour constituencies, the places where people vote Labour, voted for Brexit. So you have a situation where the two major parties no longer represent opinion in England on this issue. And England, let us be clear, is the key part of the United Kingdom. And you have a party, UKIP, which arguably did, but which has fallen apart. So we have a very severe crisis in Britain. When Peter talks about a crisis of legitimacy, I think he is putting his finger on it. And when he is talking about a crisis of legitimacy across the Western world, he's putting his finger on it too. Alex, because that is what Brexit was. It was the people of Britain, of England, voting against an establishment both in London and Brussels, which they feel no longer represents them. But there is nothing at the moment to lead them forward.
Alex, Peter, you want to jump in?
Yeah, they didn't even vote for most of the stuff that the EU represents, okay? I mean, there's an enormous amount of resentment and disenchantment, okay, and disenfranchisement. Okay? But Alex, let me ask you this, because I think it's kind of interesting, is that we've gone through this parlay ever since Brexit passed, and Brussels, under the dark and gloomy eyes of Merkel, really wanted to cut a mean and hard deal with Britain over Brexit, resentful that they want to leave. I mean, now is the British position even weaker in dealing with the European Union for departure, if that's still on the agenda? It seems like they've been knocked down a few steps now. I mean, now they have a pygmy, whoever it's going to be, as Prime Minister.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I would point out something, which is that the Brexit negotiations are supposed to be concluded by October. Yep. We now no longer have a Brexit minister to negotiate them. The entire Brexit negotiating team, along with David Davis, has resigned. And we no longer have a foreign secretary either to take that negotiation forward. So who is going to be carrying on the negotiation? Well, we now have a new minister, but is he really going to get on top of this in a couple of weeks' time? Because, of course, we've got the summer in the meantime. It's very difficult to see. So, of course, the hardliners within the EU are going to be smelling blood. And I think also one has to look at what Theresa May was proposing. What she was proposing was that Britain remain within the European single market, subject to control by the European Court of Justice, what I call, by the way, the Ukrainian option, because it's what Ukraine signed up to, and it's now what Theresa May wants Britain to sign up to. But at the same time, she also wants to opt out the freedom of movement provisions within the EU. Now, I think for the EU, that is non-negotiable. And they're going to be looking at the situation in Britain, and they're saying, why should we concede anything to a government that is clearly falling apart? So I personally don't see how this is going to work. I think we will probably get into a situation come a few weeks' time when we will have a clean break by default rather than by design. But, there's so much that could happen between now and then that we just don't really know where we're going.
Is another referendum possible?
Well, there's been a lot of talk of it. Jeremy Corbyn, who is the one person who would definitely, I think, if he supported it, make it happen, has spoken out against it. And he is the one person who is holding the line. I don't personally think it's going to happen. And I think if it did, I suspect that the result would be the same as with the previous referendum. But, in this extremely fluid situation, nothing is certain. And I think an awful lot of people, if they were asked this question all over again in a new referendum, would be extremely angry. And if that new referendum happened and came up with a result that was different from the previous referendum, I think there would be so many people across Britain and in England who would feel so betrayed that it would simply store even more problems, even more of a crisis of legitimacy further down the line. So you would have a solution which wasn't really a solution at all.
Alex, can you remind our viewers here, what was the Brexit question? What was the question that people voted on? Do you remember it?
It was extremely simple. Do you want to be in the EU or do you not? And you're absolutely right, Peter. That question which was answered quite unequivocally. I mean, there was a majority that said they do not want to be in the EU. That question has been disastrously smudged. Both by Theresa May and her incompetent leadership of the Conservative Party, by a large part of the British establishment, which doesn't want any sort of Brexit at all, and by the weakness and confusion of the pro-Brexit faction within the Conservative Party, which has never got its act together.
So just to be clear here, the electorate wasn't asked if they wanted an association agreement with Europe, right?
Absolutely not.
Okay, I'm glad we cleared that up. I'm glad we cleared that up. Okay. No, my whole point is here, because I don't live in the UK, but this is a complete betrayal of the referendum popular democracy project. This is a complete betrayal. The electorate voted for Brexit, and then Theresa May takes it upon herself to negotiate an association agreement. Okay,
you're absolutely right. And can I just explain? That is why we are seeing resignations now. Because what happened was David Davis and Boris Johnson had this meeting with Theresa May in her country house and appeared to sign up to this. And when they left, they were told by all their supporters, this is absolutely not what we wanted. This is not what we voted for. This is not what you said you would lead us to. This is not the outcome that, you're the leaders of Leave. You didn't say that this is what we were going to get. And we do regard it as a betrayal. And if you look at the sort of letters columns of the Conservative and pro-Brexit media, and if you look at places like the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail and wherever, they are full of anger about this. And I think that is why people like Davis and Johnson have found that they just had to resign if they were going to retain any credibility with their supporters at all.
Alexander Mercouris, so what can Theresa, we're probably the first doing a podcast on this. What does she say to the public now? What does she say?
Well, Theresa May has never spoken clearly to the public about anything. That became very clear during the election last year when she proved a completely hopeless communicator to the public. And the reason she proved such a hopeless communicator is because she doesn't have any clear ideas. You have this expression in Britain that she's the Maybot. The robot May who simply articulates whatever she's programmed to say and does so without feeling or conviction. And I'm afraid that's going to be the problem. That is why her leadership is in crisis. Because what people were looking for in 2016 was a strong leader who would deliver Brexit, and what they got instead was a weak leader who doesn't even know her own mind.
So Alexander, who's next in line, real quick, who's next in line in your assessment to take over for May, or on the power tree, on the structure? Is it Boris Johnson? Is it who is it?
A very good question. I don't know, actually, and I don't think anybody does.
If you had to throw some names out, who would they be? Some names out. Well, 2-3 names.
A possibility is a man called Michael Gove, who is a very important minister in the government. He is a known supporter of Brexit, a hardline supporter of Brexit, supposedly, both a friend and at times a rival of Boris Johnson. I say a friend. I think actually they don't like each other, but officially they're friends. That's one possibility. That would be the possibility if the Conservatives really wanted to take a strong pro-Brexit line. Michael Gove would be that person. The other one is our completely uncharismatic grey man of British politics, Philip Hammond, who is the Chancellor. He is an anti-Brexit functionary, a technocrat, not anybody that anybody, I think, could convincingly see as Prime Minister, but he might be seen by some people as a safe pair of hands until an election was out of the way. Personally, I think that would be a disastrous choice, and I think that would actually compound the problems. But we are so detached from reality at the moment within the British elite that I don't think Philip Hammond is an option that people should exclude. He was, by the way, an extremely anti-Russian.
I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, Alexander Mercouris, have the news? This is very breaking news right now. Has it been mentioned in the British press that this is all Putin's fault yet?
Well, not yet, but I suspect before long it will be. I mean, after all, the anti-Brexit position increasingly, if you go to places like The Guardian, and to some extent the BBC, is that the only reason Brexit happened at all, why we lost the referendum, was because of Putin and his trolls, and the fact that a financial backer of Leave had a number of dinners with the Russian ambassador. So of course it's Putin's fault. So, that's their line. I mean, I'm going to make an actual general observation. I mean, you're absolutely right to talk about Russophobia in Britain. The reason Russophobia in Britain has become so bad over these last 2 years, beyond anything we've ever had before, is partly because Russophobia, hatred of Russia and of Vladimir Putin, is the only thing this very divided British political elite can agree about anymore. They're split on everything else. So the one default position that they still have is bashing Russia. And
I would add on to that the hatred, the Russophobia, the hatred of Russia, the demonization of Vladimir Putin somehow dissipates the legitimacy of Brexit itself. Okay, they're part of the same algorithm.
So
because
Peter,
in their mind, Brexit happened because of somehow Russia. Yeah,
right,
go ahead.
So Peter, going on the Russia angle, does this affect the Trump-Putin meeting? Does it free up Trump? Does it give Trump some talking points and some bragging rights? Because we know that he wasn't too fond of May. Does this free up Putin and how he deals with Trump, especially with regards to NATO and the UK's position to NATO, or is this just a non-issue?
I think it's a marginal issue for Donald Trump, but because what you and I have talked about earlier is that essentially Trump has contempt for the leadership of the EU, and I would probably throw in NATO as well because they're basically the same. I don't think it changes very much. It probably confirms Donald Trump's assumption that leadership in Europe can't be counted on, and if they're going to get anywhere, they better get in line. And if they don't get in line, well, then you're big enough, rich enough, you can go on your own. And if you think the Russians are so threatening to you, maybe you'll pay for your defense then. But we all know that they won't, because the threat is non-existent. So I think Theresa May, this is a very interesting sunset of her public life, because she made a complete fool of herself in Britain and in the EU, in NATO, in the world at large. I mean, a very insignificant leader that will be very, very quickly forgotten, and she'll somehow be tied to some kind of negative expression with failure and the inability to be a leader when a country really needed a leader. She failed.
Yeah, Alexander, how do you think she's going to resign? Do you think they're going to throw her out? And what kind of timeline do you give this whole thing?
As I said, I think there's a fairly strong chance she could be out within a week. Because, I mean, if there is a critical mass of Tory MPs demanding a leadership election within the Tory party, I think she will realise that her position is unsustainable. What now depends, I think, what is... But
does she resign? Does she come out on TV and say, I resign? Or do they actually, kick her out?
Well, they don't kick her out. That would require a leadership election. But I don't think, as I said, she would risk a leadership election, because I think the chances are she would lose it. So I think she would resign. And the way prime ministers in Britain resign is they send a letter to the Queen informing the Queen that they're resigning, and that is then published. And then after the resignation, they appear on television and announce it. So that's the way it's done.
I think, Alexander Mercouris, I think a really important point here. Personally, I'm tired of talking about Theresa May because I think she's quickly becoming part of the past. But really, a really pressing issue is Jeremy and the possibility that he could come into power. I cannot see under what circumstances the deep state would allow that to happen. His position on the Palestine issue, on NATO, these are, in a very odd, almost macabre way, part of the Trump school of foreign policy in a way, particularly when you look at NATO and the European Union. Theresa May was like warm milk and toast, okay, but Jeremy He does. They do know what he stands for. He's got a decades-long track record. So, I mean, what is the prospect of a Jeremy prime ministership? I mean, this is like imagining Trump in 2015.
If there was an election and Jeremy Corbyn won it, then, I mean, the only way to stop him would be through some kind of a coup. And in Britain, we can arrange things like that. I mean, there could be defections of his party. There could be all sorts of things. But you're absolutely right. The deep state in Britain, which, let's be very clear, exists in Britain, hates Jeremy Corbyn. During last year's general election, Sir Richard Dearlove, who was the head of MI6, that's our British intelligence service, the people who supposedly employed James Bond, he actually wrote an article for the Daily Telegraph in which he referred to Jeremy Corbyn as a clear and present danger to Britain. Those were the words he used. So they're going to pull out all the stops to prevent Jeremy Corbyn, or all the knives, to prevent Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister. Jeremy Corbyn has defied every obstacle that's been placed in his way up to now. Whether he will be able to continue doing so, we'll just have to wait and see. I think it's touch and go. I think there's a big critical mass of people in Britain who are looking to him and who would support him. But of course, he has very entrenched enemies. And if I could just say something about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is known to dislike Theresa May. I mean, it's become absolutely clear. There are articles about that in the newspapers in Britain, that he finds her boring, that she lectures him, and that he's becoming incredibly irritated by her. Whereas the interesting thing about Jeremy Corbyn is that though Trump and Corbyn disagree almost completely on domestic policy, on foreign policy, they're actually pretty close. Because as you rightly say, Peter, Corbyn and Trump are both skeptical about NATO. They both want better relations with Russia. They are against interventions all over the world.
And skeptical of the EU.
And skeptical of the EU. The one thing they don't agree about, of course, is Israel-Palestine. Right. But on everything else, I mean, you could even see them potentially, if they were able to put their prejudices to one side, they might even find some kind of a common language. And of course, we know what the deep state in the US thinks of Donald Trump. We know what the deep state in Britain thinks of Donald Trump. One can just imagine what the deep state in both countries is going to think of Jeremy Corbyn. And the idea of Corbyn and Trump working together, I think, would be, for them, the ultimate nightmare.
So well, you can't even write a Hollywood script for that. Gentlemen, well, exactly. I think we're going to probably wrap up pretty soon. But one of the things I think is very interesting, if we can kind of look at this in a step back, it shows how entrenched bureaucracies in the EU and in the United States are fighting popular democracy, popular will. And we're seeing endless examples of it coming out right now. And this is a real crisis of not only institutions, but what popular government is all about. I mean, Alexander Mercouris said to us, which maybe a decade, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, you know, the deep state knows how to deal with people like that. I mean, that's what they used to say about the Soviet Union, you know, authoritarian governments. And now it's almost passé that, you know, they're going to go after him. Unelected bureaucrats, nameless, faceless. I think it's a very interesting time that we live in here. And it's and partly it's because of very weak leadership. Look at the Obamas and the Theresa Mays and the Merkels, you know. The left loves them as great leaders, but they're not.
Well, a couple of years ago, we would have never even mentioned the word deep state, and now it's become just mainstream. So, I mean, it's everyone talks deep state now.
Actually, the New York Times in December, after the November of Trump, put it on as a headline, their main headline. And I remember being on CrossTalk and pointing it out. I can't believe this mainstream rag actually says the deep state. You're absolutely right, Alex.
So on that point, we will... Yes, Alexander, you want to say something?
I was just going to say the reason why we have such weak leaders is because the deep state has become so strong. When the deep state is so strong, it won't allow strong leaders.
Well, when you're up high, Alexander, there's only one way to go. It's down. So
exactly.
When you're that high.
No, because election, quote unquote, democracy was supposed to legitimize the choices and options and aims of the deep state, okay? And that's why we had these characters put out in front of us. And Theresa May ended up being a very poor actor, okay? I have to give a kudos to Barack Obama. He did exactly what they wanted him to do, and he had a nice face and eloquent touch, okay? But you're right. You know, it's the popular democracy, quote unquote, that's supposed to legitimize the choices of the deep state. Yeah. That's the way it is.
And let's not forget, the deep state also had a very poor actor set up for the U.S., and her name was Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And so Trump came in and totally blew that part. And so,
well, I mean, you guys, you got to know. I mean, Alexander, Christoforou, you and I have talked about this before. Is that Trump knows that in Theresa May's government, they were meddling in the U.S. election. Yeah. Remember, we talked about he's got the names in his head who he dislikes because he knows that they worked against him. Okay, Christopher Steele, the dossier, the works. Okay, if there was outside meddling in the American election, it came from Britain, not from Russia.
Absolutely. 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 On that note, guys, we are going to wrap this up. We have been talking for a good 30 minutes plus on this story. Now, I'm sure we could talk for another 30 minutes plus. This is a developing story, though, and be sure, everyone that's watching this video, we will be covering this story on the Duran and on this YouTube channel. Peter Lavelle, host of RT's CrossTalk, thank you very much. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran, thank you very much. Guys, if you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to get notifications every time we push out a new video. Don't forget to visit Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt, help support the Duran. Until next time, take care.